So on this panel, and I'll ask the panelists to come up and sit in the first three chairs as I call your name and introduce you. We have Robert Ellsberg, who is the editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis books, where he has worked for 39 years. Orbis played a crucial role in publishing works of Latin American liberation theology, beginning with A Theology of Liberation by Gustavo Gutierrez, but also then the publication of Black and Womanist theology and other voices from the margins. He himself is the author of many prize-winning books, including All Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses for Our Time, Blessed Among Us, and editor of 6 volumes of writings by Dorothy Day, including Dorothy Day Spiritual Writings. And Robert, as the editor of in-chief at Orbis Books for almost 40 years, I know that Orbis does not have a monopoly on liberation theology, but I don't know if there has been a publishing house more committed to liberationist scholarship and spirituality than Orbis Books. I think the motto is publishing books that matter, scholarship that matters, and I know you do just that. So given your work as an editor and publisher of liberationist texts from around the world, truly global authorship, and giving your own scholarship and writing on Dorothy Day, Pope Francis, and other spiritual guides for our time, I'm really excited to hear how you will address this question of where liberation is coming from, where it's at, and where it's headed in the future. So welcome to Robert. You can come up and have a seat. Now we have Dwight and Hopkins. Dwight Hopkins attended Groton School for 5 years, an all-boys boarding school in Groton, Mass., Harvard University for a BA in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Union Theological Seminary for his PhD in New York City, and another PhD at University of Cape Town in South Africa, and also attended the Kellogg School of Management for an MBA at Northwestern University. So these are your familiar environs now. Hopkins is the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professor at University of Chicago. His interests combine the humanities with wealth ownership. His conversations on Black liberation theology touch on how poor and working class Americans can have wealth ownership. Hopkins is thinking about how faith plus wealth can bring about freedom. And Dr. Hopkins, you are one of the foremost scholars of the second generation of Black liberation theologians in the United States. And in particular, your work has relied on a scholarly method that seeks to uncover what's actually going on in Black life, in the church, in the community, in politics and economics, and how the Jesus story contributes to freedom for Black people, particularly those who are poor and working class. Given your decades of scholarship and teaching in this area, I'm really also very excited to hear what you think about assessing this question of the past, present, and futures of liberation theology. So welcome to Dwight Hopkins. And finally, Grace Ji-sun Kim was born in Korea, educated in Canada, and now teaches in the United States as professor of theology at Earlham School of Religion. She is the author or editor of 26 books. I don't know many people as prolific as Grace, honestly, but most recently, Feminist Theologies, Earthbound, When God Became White, and Invisible. Kim is the host of the Ma Dang podcast, which is sponsored by Faith and Reason. She blogs on her Substack, Loving Life, so you can find her all out there on the internet. And she's written for Huffington Post, The Nation, Sojourners, Baptist News Global, Faith and Leadership, and Time magazine. Kim has appeared on MSNBC, PBS, and C-SPAN. She's been a guest on BBC Radio, ABC, Soul Search Radio, WBEZ Radio, and Keep Hope Alive Radio. She's a book series co-editor for Palgrave Macmillan for the series Asian Christianity in the Diaspora, and has served on the American Academy of Religion's Board of Directors. Kim is honored to be included in the Englewood Review of Books list of 10 important women theologians that you should be reading. Grace, your prolific scholarship has incorporated liberative and healing paradigms from feminism and intersectionality, gender and sexuality, spirit and Sophia, race and Asian American women's invisibility, whiteness, sexual violence, ecology, and climate justice. You've covered it all. So given all of this scholarship and the conversations you have with folks from around the world in your travels and on your podcast, what do you think we should learn from and about liberation theology's past and present, and where do you think it should be headed in the future? I can't wait to find out. So come on up, Grace.
And thank you, Liz, and everyone here today, and for this invitation to be part of this. Edgardo said that he's not a liberation theologian, doesn't like to call himself that. I can do him one better. I'm not even a theologian. But I've published a lot of them. I worked with James Cone for over 30 years. It was one of my great privileges, and I have to note that Orbis is sort of a nexus here in that actually all three people sitting here to my right, as well as Kelly Brown Douglas, are Orbis authors. And so, I feel my sort of imposter syndrome here. Liz had said, just sit and this can be a conversation, just say whatever you feel like. And then I listened to Edgardo and Liz and Kelly give these incredible presentations that they stayed up all night working on. And I was just scribbling down some notes. But James Cone, once I asked him whether he was participating in the Black Lives Matter protests, and he said, "I protest with my pen." And I sort of think, well, I protest with my red pencil. Let me give you a little bit of my story. I go back to the 70s. She said I was at Orbis for 39 years, so you can see that I was only 12 years old when I came to Orbis. But no, I started in the 70s when I was 19, working with Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker for the last 5 years of her life. And I really imbibed this, spirit of the radical meaning of the gospel. And solidarity with the poor and the oppressed. And her whole life was around this integration of service to the poor, the works of mercy, charity you could call it, but with justice. And by putting those two together in a North American context, she really, at least in the Catholic tradition, invented something that didn't really exist before. But there was a third dimension to that as well. And I think it's very pertinent to liberation theology, which is imagining and envisioning and trying to live out according to an alternative set of values, to imagine a different kind of world that's possible. And that was always part of her message. She died in 1980, the same year that Oscar Romero was killed. And I left the Catholic Worker, and I went actually to Latin America. I was very interested in the changing role of the church in Latin America. And that's where I really began reading liberation theology in translation. And I just felt like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, my heart burning within me. I felt like I was hearing the gospel again for maybe the second or third time, but for a new time. And it made me want to study theology. I was in a place where prophetic bishops and clergy and lay people and religious were taking up that radical challenge of the gospel, risking their lives. And it made me see that theology was not just an academic pursuit, but that it could really be a force for changing the world. And I thought, I want to do that. So I came back and I went to Harvard Divinity School and studied theology. And this kind of question of accountability that came up before, arose for me. Who am I doing this for? After a few years, I began to kind of lose heart because I'd had this idea that I wanted to study theology because I wanted to be somehow of service to the church, and that element of the church which was really trying to change the world, and I didn't see where this was going. And it was at that point that, just amazingly, I got this invitation to be editor-in-chief of Orbis Books. So I came to Orbis at a time when our program was primarily focused on Latin American liberation theology. So I worked with and published all the great representatives of that greatest generation, Ernesto Cardenal and Leonardo Boff and Gustavo Gutierrez and John Sobrino and Elsa Tamez and Ivona Guevara and on and on and on. But we also, what liberation theology was doing was essentially saying that the theology you do depends very much on the context in which you're doing it. Who are the people that you're listening to? Who are the voices that matter? And that was a revolution in theology, which didn't apply just to liberation theology, but also opened up the way to every other kind of liberation theology or feminist theology or queer theology or Hispanic or black theology, womanist theology, etc. Orbis was founded in 1970. The founder was the prophetic Marianal priest Miguel de Escoto, Nicaraguan, who actually became foreign minister under the Sandinista government. And the idea of it then was to have a publishing house that would amplify voices of what we called the Third World, which, as I said, was primarily at that point Latin American voices. And this was not by accident. It's because 1970 was just 2 years after the Medellin Conference in 1968, which represented a wholesale kind of conversion or a moment of conversion, significant moment of conversion in the life of the Catholic Church in Latin America. You have to remember, again, that context of a church that for hundreds of years had been aligned with the ideology of conquest and inequality and status quo sustained by violence and repression. And inspired by Vatican II, which had ended in 1965, they were trying to apply those kind of lessons to the context of their own continent with a sort of see, judge, act kind of methodology, starting with observation, analysis of social reality, and recognizing that the reality of Latin America was not the same world of modernity that many of the progressive theologians of Vatican II were addressing. As Gutierrez said, addressing the non-believer, or the problems posed by the modern age. Here the issue is more the problems, the questions raised, as Gutierrez said, by the non-person. In analyzing their situation as one of massive inequality, of repression, of violence, or what they called structural sin, they kind of planted the seeds of what later became known and adopted by the church in Latin America as the preferential option for the poor. And this had all kinds of implications for pastoral work, for theological education. It gave rise to new ecclesial communities, so-called base communities. It was very much based in a new reading of the Bible. And that came to kind of ultimate fruit in 1971 with the publication of Gustavo Gutierrez's Theology of Liberation. Gutierrez was, again, reading the gospel through the lens of the experience and the questions raised by the non-person, by the poor, and seeing and finding in the gospel an essential message of liberation. Same kind of message that James Cone, at the very same time, without connection with Latin America, was also writing in his Black Theology of Liberation, which was published in 1970. Cone would later join Orbis as one of our authors, and in fact, we published or reprinted virtually all of his books right up until the memoir, Said I Wasn't Going to Tell Nobody, published posthumously. Gutierrez said that your theology depends a lot on what you see when you look outside your window. And when he looked out his window in his poor parish of Rimac, where he was a parish priest as well as a teacher of theology, he saw misery, he saw poor. What does poverty mean? It means you die before your time. Your children die before their time. So the gospel of liberation is also a gospel of life. It's a gospel that calls the world and the church in service to the world to be a force of liberation on behalf of the poor and oppressed. Well, very soon our program then grew because like mushrooms, this message of liberation and contextual theology. And again, think about that contextual theology. Before Medellin, there was no such thing as Latin American theology, much less liberation theology. There was just what we naively called in the West normative theology. It's theology, what Latin Americans were doing kind of exposed the falseness of that, and the response from around the world began to generate from South Africa and other in Africa, Palestine, South Korea, Philippines. We published works from all these places, and eventually began to realize that that we can't just be a museum of Latin American liberation theology, or an archive or something. We have to continue to listen to what are the new challenges. How does the gospel respond to the challenges that face us today? It was actually Leonard Oboff in our program who first linked liberation theology, option for the poor, with option for the earth, cry of the earth, the cry of the people. That is again something that 50 years later or 40 years later, Pope Francis and the Catholic Church would embrace. Just as the whole concept of the option for the poor, preferential option for the poor, became a bedrock element of Catholic social teaching. I had the privilege of working with Cone, Dolores Williams, Virgil Elizondo, Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, Boff, Sobrino, Ernesto Cardenal. We published innumerable books by and about Oscar Romero, Elsa Thomas, Ivan Gabarra, some of the people I've mentioned. But then, another generation as well, some of whom are represented here. I think of, we think now that often it's the temptation to think, oh my gosh, no one's ever faced the kind of challenges that we're facing with incipient fascism, climate, catastrophe, and all these kinds of things. And you think about what people living under slavery who received the gospel from their so-called owners, and discerned in it a message of liberation, the determination that God didn't want them to be slaves, that God wanted them to be free. Think of the challenge that was faced in Latin America in turning around a church that had been solidified in support of the status quo for 500 years. And they faced, it was not just a question of whether you can get tenure or not, a question of whether they would live or die. During the time of my working there, we dealt with constant pressures from the Vatican. Leonard Oboff was silenced twice, ultimately leaving the priesthood, though continuing to write theology. John Sobrino was reproved under Cardinal Ratzinger, not to mention the martyrs. I remember the time that John Sobrino was on his way to give a retreat in Thailand, and on the way to the airport, he dropped off a foreword to a book we were doing about El Salvador. It was while he was there in El Salvador that he received, in Thailand, that he received the news that his entire Jesuit community had been massacred. He alone survived. And he came back and went kind of retreat for a few weeks and wrote an extraordinary testimonial called Companions of Jesus, which I was very pleased to publish. But it was a reminder of how much liberation theology was nourished as the church in Latin America, and the church has always been nourished by the blood of martyrs, but a very distinctive new kind of martyr that arose in Latin America and elsewhere, not simply for proclaiming their faith in Christ or doctrines of the church or defending the church against atheism or whatever, but because they died like Jesus because of their commitment to the reign of God. So we face challenges today, but that's what the gospel is for. The gospel is not for just happy times. The gospel arose, the life of Jesus, as Kelly was saying, arose in the midst of the cruelest kind of empire that made blood sport of violence and Colosseum, and knew how to dispatch their enemies with the maximum cruelty. And it was in that context that Jesus spoke about the reign of God, the Beatitudes, and another way of being, another way of worshiping and living in commitment and discipleship to the God of life. The gospel is a way, it's a road, toward a path, you could say, toward life, toward virtue, toward new life. And theology in service to that is also a way. It's not the end. And liberation theology is not the end. And even liberation is not the end. Liberation is constantly and always and every time a horizon toward which we move, something that inspires us, enlarges our imagination, gives us courage, gives us a reason, gives us the grace to live, the courage to die, as so many did. I will say that you live long enough and you see some of the fruit of what you have done, some of the seeds that you have planted. One of those most extraordinary signs of that for us was the election of Pope Francis in 2013, exactly 13 years ago, pretty much. And next month will be the anniversary of his death. And here was a son of Latin America who also would not have called himself a liberation theologian, but was not afraid to acknowledge the influence of liberation theology of Romero, whom he was the first, the Pope to canonize, Gustavo Gutierrez, whom he welcomed at the Vatican. In fact, I just finished editing Gustavo Gutierrez's final posthumous work called Living and Thinking the God of the Poor, and Pope Francis wrote a long introduction to that. On our 50th anniversary, Pope Francis sent us an incredible letter, that is to say, to Orbis Books through me, that says a lot about what I feel like my vocation has been about, but I think it also speaks to this question of the future of liberation theology and what it's all about. Thanking me for writing to him and telling him about our program and everything. I'll just read a few lines from this. It's comforting and hopeful to know that among your editorial priorities, you do not seek to promote only scattered, trending, or interesting topics for release, but that you want to offer a true horizon of meaning toward which to move, a vital horizon in these times. He was writing during the time of the COVID pandemic, and he says that, in a crisis like that, we always come out different, maybe better, maybe worse, but not the same. But that will depend, to a large extent, on our capacity to cultivate, especially in the younger generations, an imagination that would help them believe that another way of writing history is possible. We need to recover memory and give voice to those who made our history great, a history that is glorious because it was forged in sacrifices, in daily struggles, in the lives given that believed in the dream of God. I like that also. The theology is kind of dreaming with God, I believe that reading, in that sense, can have a powerful role and becomes a compass that points the way, guides, and allows us to cultivate a spirit capable of moving toward great goals that embrace the good that awaits us all. In this sense, I encourage you to continue your work in that difficult but important and delicate task of creating accompanying volumes that give flight to the spirit and help reach the places where new narratives and paradigms are being formed. The health of a culture is also measured by its capacity to pool its best resources and awaken the best talents to create networks of solidarity that allow us creatively to build new alternatives to what affects us today. Now, he never uses the expression liberation theology, but I think that what he's saying is not just a description, I think, of Orbis books, but of all who try to keep that kind of dream alive under new circumstances, under the specific pressures of our time. And we look for, what Kelly calls resurrection hope, not the end of the journey, not utopia, not the kingdom of God on earth, but always just these glimpses, these possibilities. And they happen. Slavery ended, but the South rose again. We have these moments where, I thought that the Nicaraguan Revolution that many of our authors were very involved in, represented, finally here's a Christian revolution that the option for the poor, and many priests, many of my authors were involved in that. But then it sank into another kind of authoritarian regime. So the struggle of liberation theology under all these circumstances is what some have called that imagining otherwise, of disrupting the narrative that tells us that this is the way things are, and maybe even tells us that this is the way God wants them to be, and tells a different narrative, tells a story that erupts, that disrupts that kind of order, that status quo, that complacency, that captivity that implicates even Christians in repression and oppression of their brothers and sisters. But it is given the challenges that we face in the world today, the odds of success and some survival of our species even can seem questionable. But given how serious the odds are, I can think of no other more important task or better way of using our lives. And I'm very grateful that Orbis has given me an opportunity over these 39 years, more than half my life, and to work with such extraordinary authors who plant those seeds all the time. Thank you very much.
It's good to be here in North Carolina. Since I'm a Virginia boy, a lot of people don't know that. I lived in New York and Boston and California, but my heart is very Southern. Thank you for sticking around, and thank you for coming out. I never take anything for granted from someone who reads my book or comes to hear me as part of her group, so I deeply appreciate it. To the dean, to the associate dean, to the executive assistant to the dean, and to my colleagues, Kelly, I've met, I think, in 1981, so we are still in our 30s. And Robert, I met because he, through James Cone, many years ago. And to the guy, the gentleman who asked the question about white men, Robert would be an answer, one answer. His story would be one answer. And to Grace, she and I have done some stuff we'll write about after our retirement, both in terms of our writing as well as having fun. So she's a great example of cross-cultural love for people and enjoying life, which oftentimes is very rare at the Academy, at least in the United States. So I appreciate her deeply as well. I have my son here who's carrying on 7th generation of Hopkins in the United States. I'm the 6th generation. So he's Dwight the 2nd. And glad to see my road dog with me, as well as other people who have been very influential in what I do. Just want to talk a little bit about how I see the origin of Black liberation theology. We may remember, if you've read anything of James Howell Cone about Black liberation theology, he talks about several influences that gave rise to Black liberation theology. And by here, Black liberation theology, in this instance, I mean USA. He talks about the civil rights movement as being a very important factor. And one of the things I wanted to remind us about this factor that went into the origin of Black liberation theology USA, that is civil rights movement, CRM, is that the civil rights movement, particularly under the leadership of Dr. King, was focused on poor people. It was focused on materially poor people and working class people. Obviously, Montgomery was the beginning of it, but if you look at some of those documentaries, you'll see in those church congregations are these black washerwomen. My mother was from Virginia, so I know a little bit about those types of church women. People who changed the sheets, worked in the hospitals, people who took trash out of the hospitals and needles stuck their hands. There was a big movement with black women and workers this is at Duke. I don't know if anybody knows about that struggle, but I did my BA thesis on black workers organizing at Duke. So I spent a year down in Durham. It's from 1971 to 1975, 1976. But these are the people who constituted the civil rights movement under Dr. King's leadership. Specifically, he talked about the Poor People's Campaign, which was his last final campaign in the spring of 1968. And it was a coalition of people from all walks of life in the United States, specifically, globally connected, but specifically U.S., who were poor and working class people. Native Americans all over to Hispanics, Chicanos, all, of course, Negroes, African Americans at that point, white workers as well. So he was focusing my read of Dr. King, particularly the last, I would say from Montgomery, December 1955, but particularly the last Poor People's Campaign, which he didn't see because he was assassinated, on poor people, working class people. And they fought for jobs, they fought for income, they fought for ownership of wealth, redistribution of wealth, or at least people having a piece of the pie so families could advance and flourish in life. Similarly, if you look at, again, we're talking the Civil Rights Movement as the first factor that goes into the rise of Black Liberation Theology USA. And BLT, Black Liberation Theology, chooses themes from the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement, but the Civil Rights Movement. If you listen to Dr. King's speech the night before he was assassinated, which is April 3rd, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, at I think a Church of God in Christ church that evening, he talks about the economic factor, the wealth factor, and he says, he talks to Mr. Jesse Jackson in the speech, and he says, we got to move toward the economic path now. And he says, put your money in a black bank, put your money into a black insurance to serve the community. Now, again, back then, because it's segregated, you're serving poor and working class people. That's your constituency, because they had no alternative to have money, to save money for school fees. I was born in Richmond, Virginia in segregation. When I tell my children, when I was born, there were only 48 states in the United States. After I was born, Hawaii and Alaska came in, so I was 48 states. I go way back. They think I'm a prehistoric caveman or something, Robert. But so when he's talking about that, he is focused on poor working class people because they had no alternative. They couldn't bank anywhere else to help their children, schools, Boy Scouts, churches, to build churches, all those things. So again, in terms of the Poor People's Campaign, in terms of the last speech before he was assassinated, one of the things that King was picking up, there are other things as well, nonviolence, which goes into this as well, right? But he was picking up on the economic things, specifically for poor and working class people. When we look at the Black Power movement, which Cone indicates is another major factor that gave rise to his Black liberation theology, we have to remember what is the origin of Black Power, the theme and the movement. So in the early 1960s, there was a group called Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was the youth wing of the Civil Rights Movement. And it was nonviolent, so it was Christian, obviously, right? But Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks and great leader from Greensboro, if I said his name, Clyde Sellers, others too, who were part of the southern part of SNCC, but particularly Stokely, they had been rooted in Mississippi, not flying around, but they had been rooted. And they had come to the conclusion on June 16th, 1966, on the Meredith March Against Fear, co-led by literally by Dr. King and Martin and Stokely Carmichael. You can see it now, they're locked arms. And so the reporter asked King, well, I still believe in nonviolence. And Stokely, no, we're not, we're moving beyond that. So on June 16th, 1966, during that march, Meredith March Against Fear, Stokely jumped on a flatbed truck and says, what we need now is power, we need black power. And Willie Ricks echoed it and pumped it up. The original definition that Stokely had in his inner core, that black power meant at least two things based on his local organizing in Mississippi. One was that black people should be represented in the political realm, and two, whatever land the poor black people and rural peasants worked on, they should own the land. Those were the original definitions of black power. Now, intellectuals and privileged blacks like me, I wasn't around in the movement, but we got expanded to all kinds of definitions. But that was the original definition, which I think is very poor, very apropos at this point. And so as I read Cone, or as Hopkins reads Hopkins, Black liberation theology, the origin of it comes out of those foundational themes, both from the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Local organizing with poor and black working class people. And so the origin of the definition of Black liberation theology draws on those themes. Obviously, if you have read Cone's first book, which came out in March of 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, the first chapter 1 explains what blackness is and social, economic, political relationships. And often people get stuck on chapter 1 because either you get excited about it, this is the sharp Cone, right? Or you sort of, wait, I'm not whitey or whatever. The younger Cone could really, maybe latter Cone as well, spoke truth to power. So methodology, liberation theology, start with social context, you lay that out. That's just chapter 1. Then the second step in liberation theology, methodologically speaking, is do a theological interpretation of the analysis. Chapter 2 is classic. If you read chapter 2 of Cone's, which came out in 1969, classic themes. If you get a chance, go back. Just start with chapter 2. All the poor people, the gospel of Jesus Christ for the poor and the oppressed. It's classic. Just read it. So he's doing, as I read him, chapter 1, first step, commitment, engagement with the people. That's the first step. Step 2 is then theological reflection, synthesis, and step 3, return to the people. So it's a great book, particularly go back and look at chapter 2. And as I understand it too, his understanding of Black liberation theology and my understanding, I won't speak for Cone. He has spoken volumes, and his students, we're all still here all over the world. But my understanding is that the original Black liberation theology is focusing on poor and working class Black families and communities. And so a lot of the classic texts of that first generation of Black liberation theologians in the U.S. drew a lot on Luke chapter 4, verses 16 and following. The Spirit, nicely articulated by, I think, Robert, maybe some others who elaborated on it. And we're all aware of that, right? It's classic text for liberation theology, Black liberation theology, and others. As well as in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 and following, which is, we talk about the sheep and the goat. But it's literally saying, if you want to go to heaven. So for me, Luke 4:16 is not just a trope or something we use for liberation theology. It is, for me, the first public proclamation of Jesus Christ on how and why he came to heaven. I think it's like the state of the universe speech. That's my understanding. If he spoke before that, I hadn't heard about it. So it's a very important text. Why did Jesus Christ come to earth? Luke chapter 4, verse 16. And Matthew 25, verses 31 and following, for me, is the only and the clearest definitions that Jesus leaves us on how to get to heaven, however heaven it means, materially, across the water, or to go to see Big Mama and Papa eventually. So if we want to get to heaven, all Christians want to get to a new life, right? I call it heaven. He lays out the criteria. It's very clear. Matthew 25. And it's no accident that it parallels his self-revelation of his own criteria for being Jesus, God on earth. So again, the emphasis, to me, it strikes me that those passages, particularly Luke chapter 4, verse 16, undergird a liberation theology, at least the first generation, as I would say, second generation as well. So again, to me, there's a theme about Black liberation theology that talks a lot about poor and working class people. And the other thing to me about it is that a lot of those folks were involved in local organizing. So for my dissertation, which was published by Orbis Books under the leadership of Robert Ellsberg, so I interviewed, it's a Black Theology, USA, South Africa, Politics, Culture, and Liberation, and I interviewed 15 Black liberation theologians who started Black liberation theology from 1966 up to 1987. And I went to South Africa and interviewed 15 of the originators of Black liberation theology in South Africa. But they were all localists, like probably, who knows, 95%. They were pastors, they were locally organized, they were teaching, but they were linked to local communities, particularly in the north. NCBC was a heavily northern organization, but it reflected Negroes and Black people nationally. So the second thing, first theme is Black liberation theology. My understanding is the poor and working class Blacks. That's the social location. And that's the object of the gospel. And through them is universal gospel. But through them is the universal gospel. And the second thing I get from Black liberation theology historically is that it's linked to some type of local organizing in certain communities, because they were all referencing something. I remember one Black, he was a United Methodist pastor in Brooklyn, big name, he's passed now, but still I won't reveal his name. I introduced him, I interviewed him one of the 15. And he said, Dwight, in 1968, America was on fire. And as a pastor, my pastoral duties in Bedford-Stuyvesant was to take my huge Cadillac, he said, and get these young black guys with Molotov cocktails and tanks, put them in the back of my trunk, put my collar on, and drive them through the National Guard out. That was black theology, he said. I said, oh wow, that's a whole new understanding. But it was locally rooted somewhere, right? And the issue of, I think Kelly raised beautiful, the accountability was to those people, that they were raising questions that theologians and pastors and leaders were responding to. And the people weren't bringing them in, imposing it. It was responding to whatever questions they had. So those two themes I wanted about poor and working class orientation, the importance of being at some point, or some folks being locally organized or linked to local communities. The other thing I wanted to mention is I'm working on a project in terms of moving forward is called Faith Plus Wealth Equals Freedom. Faith Plus Wealth Equals Freedom. And it comes out, again, my read of Black Civil Rights Movement, my read of Black Power Movement, my read of Black Theology Liberation, First Generations, both sides of the Atlantic. It's my interpretation, hermeneutic, if you will, of the gospel of Jesus. I call it the Jesus stories. And it also reflects part of my own sensibility, my personality. I've always been a local organizer. You don't get paid in the academy to tell your story, right? Unless you're in our classes, then you tell it. But, I've been concerned about local justice or local right relationships in local communities for a long time. I was first started being aware of the need for intimate local, we call them mustard seed examples now. When I was in charge of a committee for the Boy Scouts in Richmond when I was a teenager. Before I went to Groton, where was my Groton connection? There he is. Yes, his son went to Groton too. And it just struck me that it was in relationships, intimate relationships, that things got done. And it trained me or called me to listen to those voices on the ground in small communities. And then when I went to school, we founded the first Black student union at Groton. And again, it was inter-community, listening to the voices of those privileged. Well, we were working class who got full scholarships as a result of King being killed. That's how we got there. But we were all 4.0. We were academically. Wasn't no affirmative. We were all academically just, we did our thing. And so we built organizations there. And then I went to college, helped found a Black student organization and a Third World student. We call it the Third World Student Organization. But again, it's intimate people who are organizing locally over a period of time, listening to the people there and trying to be part of a movement there. And then when I graduated from college, I went to New York and I was a community organizer in Harlem, for 4 or 5 years, every day in and out, dealing with roaches, dealing with downtown and trying to serve the people, right? With this privileged background. But it was committed. Those were the Black people I was referring to. And then, of course, when I met James Howell Cohn in the summer of 1981, and it was it changed my entire life because I was on to business school, and the idea was to make $1 billion from an Ivy League business school, whose name I won't mention, and give it away. Young, you're going to. And I'm gonna get the man's money and give it to the people, right? So it's, get the man's resources, give it to the people. But by volunteering and being an organizer in Harlem for those years, it just changed my life in a profound way. And James Cone Kelly mentioned the thing about, well, let's put it this way, her story is so parallel. A lot of us, particularly men who I know, young people, we had left the church. Because we can understand how can we be Black and also be Christian. That was basically, we may not have articulated that way, but that's what we left. But when I read Cohn's first article in summer of 1981, it changed my entire life. Went back to the church. A whole group of people, I could tell, some have retired, went back into the church because of James Cohn. So that was a big road. Instead of going to business school, I went to organize in Harlem and then met Cohn, which is another story, which changed my whole direction in my whole life. But still, I was in Harlem organizing like a 6-5 block radius, always rooted somewhere and listening to those people, what they had to say, right, as the accountability piece. And even when I was at Union, Kelly, I don't think Cohn would elect this, but I was quietly for 7 years doing pulpit duty. I don't know, maybe he didn't tell his women this, but George comes, yo, how you going to do the church and be an academic, right? So I didn't tell him much about that, but I was in the pulpit 7 years at Bethany Baptist Church in William Augustus Jones Jr. there, Kentucky Hooper. And my ministry was senior citizens home in Bedford-Stuyvesant, older black people. And I learned more from them than I taught them. And then I moved to Oakland, California. My first teaching job was in Silicon Valley, but I lived in Oakland. And again, I worked in East Oakland before it was gentrified with J. Alfred Smith Sr., who recently passed. And my ministry there was education young people for those 7-8 years. And then Chicago, I worked 18 to 20 years on the J. Alfred Jeremiah Wright at Trinity United Church of Christ. My ministry was men's ministry, Bible study, and helping the minister in training. MIT's got MIT people up, so I was helping him do that. But always, it's just I've been locally there, and that's the energy, that's what I'm hearing. And sometimes it contradicted what I believe, right? Because here are people who are living every day, trying to make a way out of no way, and just incredible. Obviously the men too, but also some of the women. A single mother, and I think single mothers are great. But I grew up with a father, so that's my model. But some of the single women in all those places, they should have MBAs. They should have public. I mean, how can a single mother raise 6 daughters, 6 children by herself? It's just, and I'm trying to just deal with this little 9-year-old who thinks he's 29 years old. This is my road dog right here. I believe in training. I'm into men's, boys. We want to deal with a lot of the stuff we have dealt with in Harlem, but also in Southside Chicago. And you have to be true. There's a lot of stuff going there which is not positive. And then we do men's ministries, and we had to talk a lot over the last 18, 20 years. A lot of them don't have role models. They don't know another world's possible. And so they act out. The act out is wrong. I mean, anybody I shouldn't say that. My view that it's wrong. But at the same time, there are conditions and structures and systems and historical factors that lead them to go that way. And, you get requests that, he would say, you and Obama, this is before Obama was running. So he said, well, you and Obama, y'all professors up at the University of Chicago. Y'all, we don't know anything about y'all. Y'all up there with the white people at Hyde Park. We need to know, where's the boys? I mean, stuff like, where's the Boy Scouts? Where's the boys club? I mean, I'm thinking these are gangbangers, right? So they just didn't have any role models. So what we're saying, we're just trying to give examples of the importance of linking Black liberation theology to a lot of these local issues. And it really doesn't take that much. It takes a lot of time, but the rewards are sometimes evident and sometimes not so evident. The other thing I think in terms of the future is, how do we provide spiritual and material resources to these local communities? Again, that's just my path has been that, right? And one thing is that they have a lot of creative ideas. In fact, the answers are there. That's my view. The answers are in those communities. You can ask those women, they know what to do. You can ask a lot of those young guys, even some of the guys are so-called gangbangers. But they don't have, I can give you mustard seed examples. That's another sharing. But on the part of people struggling, a lot of them don't have the resources, spiritual, material resources, to live freely. So that's why I've been working on this project, Faith plus Wealth equals Freedom. Faith plus wealth equals freedom. So faith is drawing on, for me as a Christian, the Jesus stories. That's pretty evident in this crowd. And another crowd. We just got back from 10 days doing research with venture capital with Native Hawaiians yesterday. That's what my son, we were all jet lagged. He's been surfing and jet skiing and parasailing yesterday. And now we're freezing our butts off. But we, just what communities that are struggling, what is it that they need in a comparative perspective, whether it's Native Hawaiians to Native Americans to African Americans to Hispanic Americans to Chicanos, people in Miami, all over, right? Now more and more in the Asian community, what do they need in a comparative way? But particularly for African Americans, those particular communities I've been involved in, and I'm not speaking for 40 million people of African descent, let me just tell you that. I can talk about the people I know and work with over decades in local communities, that things that we take for granted, a lot of them aren't even aware that they exist. There are resources for their children and their families, for their schools. Chicago has so much food deserts. About 15 years ago, the mayor closed 20 public schools in the south side of Chicago. There's no hospital in the south side of Chicago. And we have to say, every weekend, 6 to 60 black people are shot in the black community. It may be hard for us to say it, but that's reality. That's what they have to realize. So what do? You get your child up and you hope they come home, right? That's a lot. I've been there 30 years. So if it's 10 a weekend, 10 times 52 is 520. That's 1 year, right? So for all y'all math geniuses, it's 52 times 30. You can add up the numbers. To me, that is a crisis, a national crisis. With a national crisis. So part of it is the material resources so people they have the answers, the material resources to do what they need to do. But there's also the spiritual resources. And for me, Christianity, from Dorothy Day to others to King, offer examples. Oscar Romero offer examples like that. Basically, to me, the spiritual resources that I've seen them needing is to develop harmony and balance of their life energy in each breath. That's the type of spiritual energy that they need to cultivate and try to cultivate there. We can unpack that during the conversation. So it's both spiritual resources and material resources. And if they use their faith and combine it with these two forms of material wealth, spiritual resources and material resources, which is the wealth. That's what I'm trying to say. The wealth is constituted by two aspects. Then they can practice freedom. And freedom is not owing anyone anything. That's true freedom. In order for them to be free on a daily basis to practice our vocation, our call from God. We can unpack that more, but that's what we're doing. We're trying to, how do you have faith, particularly for me, for the Jesus stories, plus wealth, both spiritual wealth and material wealth, so we can be free, truly free, to get up each day and discern and practice without owing anybody anything, what God has called me to do every day. That would be heaven for me. Now I got to do all kinds of things. You got to pay debt, you got to pay that, all of that, right? But it really is a possibility that I think can be realized as we work together. So I just want to share those things. One, in terms of where I see the original parts of the Black liberation theology arising from the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power movement, and what holds that together, the poor and working class, as well as being rooted in some local communities, learning from them, being accountable to them, building institutions over years and decades, and then offering this possibility of a project called Faith Plus Wealth Equals Freedom. And the ultimate goal is freedom to practice, to preach, to believe, and to embody what God has called us to do every day in our lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the Dean Walker, and Dr. Liz, to the faculty and staff and all the panelists. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm the last speaker, so please try to stay with me. I'll try to stay with myself too. So I was actually invited about 10 years ago to Wake. And I know some faculty were there about 10 years ago, and I was trying to remember where I spoke, and then I realized I was at the Divinity building in the lower hall, so in the basement. So I feel like today I've been upgraded into this beautiful business building. So thank you so much for inviting me back. Don't take another 10 years to invite me back. So listening to the 5 speakers ahead of me, it was very interesting to hear their personal stories and how they engage and do liberation theology. So about 10 years ago, I was speaking at Duke, and Duke has the faith and leadership. And they said, "Oh, we want to interview you." I said, "Oh, I love to be interviewed." So when they were interviewing me, they said, "You are all over the place." So maybe when Dr. Liz was introducing me, maybe that was what they were saying. They said, you're doing climate change, you're doing pneumatology, you're doing feminist and Asian American. And when they asked me, I was kind of surprised because it wasn't like a compliment question. It was like, you are kind of all over the place. So I said, without thinking much, I said, well, they all are interrelated and they all intersect. And I thought that was like a stroke of kind of genius, which I don't really get a lot, but that was one stroke. Because a few years later, then I co-wrote Intersectional Theology. Because when you're doing liberation theology, you realize that all these issues intersect. And these issues intersect to continue to oppress people. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, as a Black lawyer, she realized when she's defending Black women, it wasn't just the issue of race, but also the issue of gender. So intersectionality is a very good lens to understand how we do liberation theology. Because myself, I'm not just a woman. I'm also an immigrant woman. Immigrated twice. Our family, I was born in Korea, immigrated to Canada, did kindergarten all the way up to my PhD, and then I immigrated to the US. I'm an able woman. I'm a heterosexual woman. There are so many identities of all of us. So we're not just one-dimensional, we're multi-dimensional. And that is very, very important to recognize when we're doing liberation theology. And I kind of want to say liberation theologies, because all of us this morning and this afternoon, we are doing these different theologies that are all part of liberation theology. So when you're thinking about your own selves, you're talking about, ableism, your economic status, your education, your language, your social context, your gender, your sexuality. All of those compose who you are. And understanding who you are will help you in your own theological journey. So a few years ago, I was trying to determine how I can do theology as an Asian American woman. And I started to write a memoir, and then I soon quickly realized that nobody wants a memoir from me. So it became a more academic book. And in that book, I was trying to understand how Asian Americans are made invisible. So the book is called Invisible. And I spoke in so many colleges and seminaries, and one of the first questions that people ask me is, why is it called Invisible? Asian Americans never ask me that. Because that has been our experience for us for hundreds of years as we lived here in the United States. We have been made invisible. Before the white settlers came, it was the Filipinos who came over 500 years ago. Asian Americans were here before the white settlers were here. In 1882, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, which was only supposed to last 10 years, and it got extended by Congress. So when we're thinking about voting rights, we always think about African Americans, which is good, but we don't think about Asian Americans. We weren't allowed to vote until 1943, and that didn't include all Asian Americans. Chinese, and then Japanese, 1946, and then Indians, and then soon after, we were all allowed to vote. So the invisibility of Asian Americans and how we need to be made visible It's one thing, when you're reading Harry Potter, the invisible cloak, it's a magic or it's a superhero. But it's a different thing when society makes you invisible and tells you your issues and your concerns don't matter. That's a different issue. And I'm hoping that, intersectionality, it's a lens for us to understand the complexity of oppression and how different oppressions work together to continue to oppress certain groups of people. So when we think about invisibility, it's not just the Asian Americans. There's many other groups of people who are made invisible. The trans community, the LGBTQ community. We know this is happening in different denominations. I'm PCUSA, we were divided. And then most recently with the United Methodist Church. So these issues are so important. That's why we are all here to do liberation theologies. Whether you are called a theologian or not, we do it together. So in this theology of visibility, and I remember someone was talking about, this theology of visibility is so interesting. And they went on and on and on, and I finally said, it was me. And then they all were shocked that it was me. And I'm sometimes surprised too that I can develop something that can be a little helpful. So when I was growing up in a small town, London, Ontario, in the 1970s, racism was rampant. Every day racism happened in the schoolyard. They've never heard of a Korean. And they told me there's Chinese and there's Japanese, but there's no such thing as a Korean. So then I just thought, maybe my mom's making this thing up. So I would cry and go home and I would ask her, everyone's saying there's no such thing as a Korean. I heard in different parts of the U.S., some white people thought that if a Chinese married a Japanese, then their children were called Korean. But the racism is so rampant that for myself, you want to dissociate yourself from your Korean identity. Don't want to speak the language, the culture, the history, the ethnic identity. And it took me a long time as I was writing about the theology of visibility that I am okay. When society wants to push certain people down, the LGBTQ community, the trans community, people of color, and women, we have to stand up and say, we are okay. We are human beings. And so I had to go back to my Korean identity. And when I think about, really being dreadful, being dragged to Korean school every Saturday morning as a child, and I said, when I grow up and I ever become a mom, I will never drag my kids to Korean language school. And what did I do? 3 kids kicking and screaming to Korean language school. But there is a richness within our Korean language. So I'll just teach you 4 words this afternoon. I feel like I just had coffee, which I didn't. So I'm full of adrenaline right now. But the 4 words have been helpful in my own theological discourse. And I know I spoke at a liberal arts college and a white student was kind of upset because the talk was on when God became white. And he said, well, you're kind of not allowed to do things like that. And I said, well, I think I'm allowed to, because white European men have been doing it for the last 2,000 years. Thank you. Thank you. So I said, I think I'm allowed to do this, because they use their own language, culture, and context to talk about God. So the 4 words, to go quickly, one of them is Han. So Andrew Sung Park had written several books on Han. It's spelled H-A-N, and you might think of like the Han Dynasty, but that's not the Han that I want you to think about. So Han is a Korean term which means unjust suffering. And we know that oppressed people, Latin American liberation theologians are talking about the suffering, the option for the poor. It is unjust suffering because systems have been created like patriarchy and racism and colonialism to cause unjust suffering. The second term is qi, which you may be more familiar with. If you ever practice Tai Chi or Qigong, and I always have a group of students that practice Reiki, that qi is qi, and that means spirit. So Asians have been talking about the spirit for thousands of years. And the Israelites talked about the spirit as ruha for thousands of years. And then Christians decided to talk about the spirit as pneuma. So the Asian spirit is quite interesting because it's an embodied spirit. And that, for all of us, is very helpful because when you're fighting injustice, that's what liberation theology is trying to do. You need the spirit, the qi, to help you. The third word is chang. So some of us Korean American theologians are using chang. And I think today in 2026, we need a little bit more of chang. So chang is this Korean word which is like love, but kind of going beyond love. It's this attachment that is kind of unbreakable. So Koreans, we have a sense of attachment to each other. So even though you have a fight, you're not going to break that relationship. I taught this word to an African American leader, and we were fighting and arguing one day, and then he just said, chang. He understood it, and then he used it because we were arguing so much, and then that ended the argument. That there's a sense of attachment, the kind of love that's unbreakable, that is within Scripture. So that becomes a helpful tool for us when we're thinking about the theology of visibility. The last term is uri. So uri is this concept of our, so ourness. In the Korean language, as in many of the Asian culture and language, we don't focus so much on the individual. Everything is communal. Right? So it's like, it's not my divinity school. We would say what? Our divinity school. So we use uri for many possessives, even though it's just you talking about it. So I don't go around and talk about my dad or my mom. Even if you're the only child, we would say our mom and our dad. It even goes when you're talking about your spouse. So everyone knows you're only married to one person. You don't go around and say, my husband. What do you say? Our husband. Because that communal understanding is so important. And when we bring that into liberation theology, I'm not doing this so that I can get a better job or a better salary. It is for our Asian American community and for all the communities that are oppressed. It is this uriness, this ourness that we are fighting for. It's not the me and the individual. It is our community, our churches, our schools, and our people. And when I think about the biblical understanding, I think these four terms, the theology of visibility is helpful. And these are all these intersecting identities, intersectingness in our cultures, because when this DEI is disappearing. But when we think about DEI and about the richness of what immigrants bring to us, refugees bring to us, and just people of color that have been here for hundreds of years. There is so much richness that we can learn from each other, and that will really help us in this theological journey. So thank you so much for listening to the last speaker today.
Wow. Thank you all so much for your reflections. What a beautiful series of thoughts and musings and memories. I think earlier as well with Kelly and Edgardo, we definitely took a look at the past. And so I just wanted to draw out in my first question for you all a little bit on the topic of memory, particularly historical memory, and why is that such an important category for liberation theologies? Why should we look back, particularly to situations of incredible suffering, which multiple speakers have spoken about, and to martyrdom, the deaths of those great women and men who gave their lives for these struggles for liberation. That category of memory, Johann Baptist Metz calls, as Robert will know, calls this dangerous memory because it interrupts and it shakes up the status quo. My colleague, Dr. Melva Sampson, who may still be watching online, she teaches a course on sacred memory. There's something so sacred about looking back. The ecclesial-based communities of Latin America call this memoria histórica, the historical memory, that's so central to who they are. So that piece of memory that you all drew out, what is the meaning of that for you? Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's a very important question. One thing is that those of us who have gotten older must realize that we were young one day, okay? And somebody helped us and allowed us to be ourselves for our generation. So I'm not a tattoo, what do you call it? Body piercing. That's not my generation, okay? But we were Afro, and bell bottoms, and do your own thing. And I wonder, I don't know if it's Kelly, somebody else, what our parents, fathers, mothers and grandparents thought of us. So I'm in that position now where I'm the grandfather position. So it just helps us to remember that our young people are good. Our young people are good. We have to not start with the negativity, but they are very good. And they're going to find a way. So memory meaning just remembering that the things I used to do remind me that there's somebody above who loves me, because some of the things I did should be sitting here, right? So one is that, the memory that we used to be that age and we did things and we were allowed to explore with a guiding hand. And the second thing is to remember that there were older people who knew more than we did too. So we have this interrelation dialectic to work with young people, that relationship. And the third thing is that the memory also allows me to realize that what we're going through now, we've gone through similar things, and we thought fascism was coming. We thought that the world had come. I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, And when I grew up in Richmond, our drills weren't fired; they were nuclear bombs. The bell would go off, and you'd go underneath a wooden desk because that would keep you from the nuclear bomb. So we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all had drills, Castro, the communists would come. I remember all of that. We're that way, and we went through Nixon, the White House, not the White House, what they broke into, Watergate. He said, well, fascism is coming, the Republican Party, they're bringing in fascism, right? And then when Ronald Reagan tore down the Air Traffic Controllers Union and wiped up all the unions, CIA overthrew Allende, and Pinochet came in. A lot of them alive. The vivid things of what our government did in Vietnam, all that stuff, right? People were taken out during the Gulf Wars. There's a particularity to this picture, no question. But it is to sort of keep in perspective that as one fights now, that God has helped us make a way out of no way. Oftentimes it's very painful. So it still gives, I have a lot of hope and joy because a lot of things I have been saved. The stories we don't talk about in the academy because, you don't pay for the academy, right? But we've been blessed. But also, I know a lot of poor and working class people I've been around, not all 360 million people in the United States, have gone through some stuff that, we literally thought we literally did. So it seems facetious and crazy now, right? But the energy and life was over and, Watergate, all that stuff. And, a lot of us went through the assassinations, And don't forget, Medgar Evers was assassinated, Malcolm was assassinated, Kennedy was assassinated. RFK, it was just assassination. There's a whole bunch of assassinations in the South that a lot of us lived through that never made the news because we only had 3 TV stations and they went off at 11 o'clock. And that was the news, and that had social media. But somehow the elders in our churches in particular, not all churches, but there was churches that put their life on the line, at least in my neck of the woods, that helped us get over. So understanding, appreciating memory, we used to be young, and we were nurtured and blessed, and people were there to let us do our thing with guardrails, and also remember that elders too have stuff to learn through. And the third thing is that there's some unique particularities to this, what's going on now, but there have been times when there was a sense, at least for people who wanted life in America, who felt that fashion, who thought that this was it. That the world had and the last thing we talked about Groton. So in 1970, the New England boarding schools had an Earth Day conference at Choate in Connecticut, and I was the representative from Groton. So I was into ecology when I was like 14, right? And we thought this literally, we went to compost, go home and get compost, biodegradables, the hot water, the islands in the Pacific were going to die in 5 years. So there was an urgency there which we have to keep, but we also have to have a long sense of history as well. So those 3 things about memory I think are very important.
I was going to say about memory is it's so important to remember our past. And because, we're not just out of nowhere. We didn't come out of nowhere. So when I go to the past and trying to look at Jesus 2,000 years ago and how we understand who Jesus is today, is this dark Palestinian Jew suddenly became a white man. And it's problematic. So I think the memory, going back to who Jesus is and how Jesus suddenly becomes this white European prince or emperor, because how we view Jesus is how we view God. And how we view God impacts how we behave and act. So if we continue to uphold the white male Jesus, who he wasn't, then that gets transferred to who God is, which legitimizes white man, whiteness, white supremacy, patriarchy. And so to dismantle that, so Hart, I was really glad when you asked that question in the morning. There's a lot of dismantling to do. So the memory takes us back that, hey, why are we distorting the good news? Because it's a human action that did. It's not this divine thing that happened to distort the gospel. But power, intersectionality really challenges power and the positions of power. So it is really, the memory helps us to go back that, it's this long tradition, and where did things go wrong, and what do we need to do to dismantle this? Because if we don't dismantle it, it's going to cost lives. I was in Korea last fall, and one of my close high school friends, because my new book, Feminist Theologies, was coming, and she said, we don't need feminist theology. She said it to my face, and I said, of course we do, especially in Korea, right? Where patriarchy, Confucianism, married together is very patriarchal. But there is so much work to do because, women's bodies are being assaulted. People of color, black bodies are being murdered. There's so many problems. So I think memory helps us, and that tied in with Han. Han, we say, if you don't resolve the Han, so this unjust suffering that is within you, if you don't resolve it, it gets carried to the next generation. and on and on. And when I say that to white people, they said, oh, that's the trauma, the generational trauma. So that, you can use whatever word, but then the white people use that, and I say, okay, that's fine. But if you don't go back and understand your memory and where that is coming from, it's going to continue to happen, and other atrocities, fascism, as you mentioned, things are going to continue to happen. So if we don't go back and understand our history through our memory, we're not going to be able to break the chain and dismantle the isms that is causing our society to go into chaos at this point.
I think that the power of memory is reflected in the efforts that those in power exercise to try to erase memory, erase history. We're seeing that every day now, with libraries being emptied out, things you're not allowed to talk about, the plans now for the 250th anniversary of America, which will be, for the United States, which will be a celebration of patriotism and what made America great, and how we shouldn't have even, the parks shouldn't even have little, stickers or signs or something that make reference to slavery. We talk too much about all these bad things that just makes people, turns them against each other, and we should forget all of that. That's all. Essentially, there are no problems. We have no problems. There is no racism in those countries. We don't see color. So there's a deliberate campaign to erase memory, and I think that has to do with that way that those in power always want to convey the impression that the way things are is the way they've always been. There's always the rulers and the ruled. There are always the powerful countries that do what they can, and weak countries that suffer what they must. And it's always been like that. And to remember the way that our realities have been socially constructed and are the product of struggle and conflict, and the fact that there were alternatives along the way, all these things are very subversive to that idea that reality that we see around us is ordained by God and can't be challenged. And it's you're un-American or you're a racist or whatever if you challenge this reality of the way things are. You look at some of the, whether it was a Cone or going back to the spiritual and discovering that theme of liberation was not something that I turned on. There you go. Trying to repeat everything I said. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Sounds like why my legs were making so much noise. Speak with my legs. Going back to the spirituals and discovering the roots of that liberationist message, and then to even go back to the Gospels, as Dwight was talking about, and discover, wait a second, there was this message of liberation that was there all the time. How come I didn't learn about that? How come I didn't know about that? And to discover that there are, as Edgardo said, these guideposts in history, whether St. Francis or, as Gustavo went back to Bartolomé de las Casas and wrote, his kind of masterwork was on Las Casas, who said that that the conquistadors demonstrated that the real God was gold. They worshiped the idols of death. And he said, I left in the Indies, or in America, Christ crucified millions of times. Exactly that Matthew 25 kind of message. Those are kind of the dangerous memories that the church, is forgotten, suppressed, whatever. I write a lot about saints, as you mentioned in your introduction. It's because I have the sort of feeling that most of us are not really changed by reading a book of ethics. But all of us, I think, have been changed or inspired, or if we have ever been inspired, it's by living example, embodied hope and courage and faith. And that there are examples of people. One would be, let's say, Franz Jägerstätter, was an Austrian peasant, lay Catholic, who was the sole lay Catholic executed, beheaded by the Nazis for refusing to take an oath of allegiance to the military under Hitler. And his story was suppressed. He did this with no expectation that anyone would ever know about him, that he would ever be remembered at all. But decades later, there was a book written about him, and his story began to spread. One of the reasons people didn't in Austria want to talk about him was because, well, if you honor Franz Jägerstätter, what does that mean for everybody else? Well, for the rest of us, we had no other choice. There was no choice. You had to do this, whatever. Anyway, when you have someone then like Franz Jägerstätter remembered, or even beatified now as he has been, it opens your imagination morally to other possibilities, other ways of being. I think just kind of one lamp lights another. Courage is contagious, as they say. And so there's nothing, I think, is more valuable than remembering these kinds of stories. Dorothy Day, my mentor, when she was a young person and first read about the saints, she said she was very inspired by all that they did for the sick and the poor, the leper, he said. But where were the saints to change the social order? Not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery. And her life, she didn't really have any examples to point to. But she created her own way. She forged that own path, and now none of us needs to ask, where are the saints to change the social order? It's funny, of course, memory is a relative thing as you get older. And for those of us here, Dwight and me and everything, like Romero is is contemporary. That just like happened. And I realized that's 45 years ago that he died. And there's generations that have come now who don't have that living memory of who that was. But I think what it means now for a Romero to be canonized by the Catholic Church, to be recognized as a martyr, is to open up expand the walls, and to allow alternative and new kinds of models of a political holiness that we think, gosh, I never learned that in church. I didn't know that was a possibility. And I can't just rely on our living memory of this. People have to pass along that legacy and to students, young people, whatever. And I think that it's incredibly important and inspiring for them to have models and to think, to learn about, yes, the civil rights movement, learn about the Reconstruction period, learn about all these kinds of things of our past that are really invaluable resources.
Thank you all for those reflections. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for their questions and conversation. So in this question, I want to address kind of an elephant in the room, or the room itself, and the building that we are in, and the fact that liberation theology, especially in its origins, was very critical of capitalism. Certainly Latin American liberation theology, and Dwight, I'm so grateful to you for reminding us that early Black liberation theology, too, is committed to poor and working class people. And so I'm curious kind of how your reflections on kind of the changing relationship of liberation theologies to capitalism, economic structures, economic exploitation, labor organizing, things of that nature. And perhaps the irony that we are in the business school holding our symposium on the futures of liberation theology.
Can I just I'll make a quick comment. Ignacio Echeverría gave a famous speech at the University of Santa Clara about the role of a university. And his, ideal, and John Sobrino too, is that liberation should not be just this theme that's confined to the theology department, but that it should infuse the whole, is a Jesuit university committed to faith that does justice. That should be a rule and a guide that influences everybody. We need not just liberation theologians, we need liberation ministers, we need liberation educators, we need liberation lawyers and doctors. I published a book by Paul Farmer, who was, founder of Partners in Health, and that he was deeply influenced by Gustavo Gutierrez to understand health as a human right, and to listen to that poor people have as much right to health as anybody else, etc. So I would think that one of the work of those in the theology department, religion studying liberation, is to try to communicate that idea and that principle more widely within the university. There's nothing wrong with having an education. It's a wonderful thing. Everybody should have opportunity to do that. But it's that question of accountability that came up before, responsibility. Who is your education for? That's one of my authors, great black theologian Brian Mazengale, said that when he graduated from college, I guess it was, his grandmother gave him a dictionary. And she said, "That's great that you graduated from college. Now, who is your education for? Who does it serve?" And that's, the thing that has guided his vocation.
Yeah.
I guess I'm the only one who has the MBA up here.
Yes.
A couple of times, I think there's the theoretical arguments about capitalism, and there's also the practical reality. What do you do with it since we live here? Yeah. We could make. When I graduated from college, I had double major in Afro-American Studies / Humanities, and then Global Political Economy, which is micro, macro for all you. Any business school faculty snuck in here. You can make an argument on a theoretical level that there's a distinction between capitalism and global finance capitalism. I actually wrote a little chapter on that, the religion of global finance capital. You can make the other argument too that if you go to capitalism, you automatically go to that. So we can go back and forth. But there are folks who are actually using capital in poor communities to help transform those communities. One frontier, which I think a lot of African American youth need to go into, all youth, but particularly African American youth, is AI and social justice. And two black leaders who are the cutting edge of this are Aaron Grizzell, who's at the SSBR meeting now, and he's the executive director of the Northern California Martin Luther King Jr. Foundation, which is, I hope he doesn't lose his funding, it's just like the most left. He's a diplomat, but is very left, very progressive. He's working on some stuff. He's also working with Sylvester Johnson, who got his PhD under James Cone at Union, who's up at Northwestern, and he's doing things on AI, young people, and social justice. So that's people who are actually doing it on the ground. And I don't know if you caught the little joke, but we just flew in from Hawaii yesterday. And I was there for at least 10 days interviewing Native Hawaiians who are building venture capital to fight for Hawaiian culture. Well, they wouldn't call it the nation because that might be problematic in this regime. So they're using it. And these are the people who are fighting. What can I say, right? And there's Christians for venture capital, African Americans who help leading that. There's Black Americans for venture capital, Hispanics for venture capital, Asians. And I discovered there's prayer warriors for venture capital. And I'm like, oh my God, okay, I'm a Black liberation theologist. Explain to me. But I'm also a materialist in the sense that if they're going to use it, go ahead and use it. But they're struggling with the importance, and they're not debating a theoretical. I like both. I like the theoretical. We can get into finance capital. I love that. But also I'm trying to hear these people who are rooted in local communities who are building something. They're actually doing something for these people, right? Whether or no there'll be buyer's remorse 20 years from now is a whole other question, because that might lead them, one of these companies, when the company exit, that means this can become a billionaire company, right? So it might be one thing now you're doing mustard seed, but 10 years, 20 years from now, let's see if you're going to still be fighting for the people, right? And but the two people I know most is Sylvester Johnson, the guy who's PhD with Jim Cone, and Aaron Grizzell out in San Francisco. They're doing AI, and we're learning more from these others. Prayer, because at business school, I was like, where is everybody going?
They were praying. And I was like, wait, hey, I'm into that. I found out after I graduated. So I'm seeing these practicalities of people struggling with things, and what they're doing with it. And it's not the leading edge of capital. It's not. But I'm interested in these local mustard seed examples to help give hope, help them give hope. People, I think a lot of people need hope, particularly now, because you can get drowned in its wave upon, and social media is just, you just go to bed. It's like, I got to stop, just wake up and get older, go to bed. I don't know what you, Rob. Go to bed, go to the bathroom at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's like, sit there, but it's just, where are the seeds of hope? And that's why I'm so much into education, because young people are doing it. They just go ahead and do it, just put things together, build stuff. And here's a problem, let's solve it like that. So, on the theoretical level, I think it'd be a rich conversation. I would love to engage to have a little training in that, and I've written some stuff on that, Global Monopoly Finance Capital, and built an international organization to fight it. It's called the International Association of Black Religions and Spiritualities, we brought together 14 countries around the world of local organizers, professors, and pastors, all three. Very rare in one organization for 8 years. And I'm a comparativist. That's why I went to Hawaii to look at venture capital yesterday, got back, to see what we can learn from others. Because I think, particularly for the African American, Black American perspective, we have a lot of answers to the problems that are facing us on a macro level in those local communities. My heart is just so, so of course, you just go, let me be an organizer. I want to offer you this. And it's like, look, man, we just need to get some food, okay? Because we don't have it's a food desert. I can't believe it's 2026 in the south side of Chicago. And there are churches who are on the cutting, Trinity United Church of Christ and others are on the cutting edge, no question. And there's other places too, But it's like a wave of evil impacting these communities. And I'm always amazed at the mustard seed examples of hope that they're doing on their own. And part of what keeps me going is that, young people in that. So even within the midst of capitalism and even global finance capitalism, I still find hope in those local communities.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have an MBA, so I don't know much about, money or capitalism, but I just want to link it to climate change because the intersectionality, when we're thinking about climate change, it intersects with economy, with gender, and with race. And so we know that when storms hit, the poor nations are suffering way more than the rich nations. We can rebuild and we can hide somehow better, but there's already a lot of report, especially those who live like on beaches, like waterline areas or the island countries. When these storms hit, they're losing their livelihood. Whether they were farmers or they raised animals, they're losing their whole livelihood. And so the men will leave their families behind to go into the larger cities to find jobs and to make money and to send money back. Sometimes they're able to send money back, sometimes they're not. And so the women are, left there with younger children or disabled or the elderly, and they can't survive. So you already see the gender affecting economics with climate change. And this is how human trafficking is on the rise, which also leads to sex trafficking. So these different oppressions intersect to continue to oppress. And so, we have a lot of work to do. When we're doing this liberation theology, we're not just tackling one issue. You are tackling a lot of these issues, which all intersect to continue to oppress.
Well, thank you so much.